My name is Veronica Reynolds. I am the head of community relations at New City Library. And normally, if you come to a Zoom program at our library, I have another presenter in to tell you all about their topic of interest. But today, I am here talking about my topic of interest. If you haven't attended one of my lectures before, I do like to cover topics of usually historical British and extended UK um, literature, but today we're going to be talking about an Irish author. Now, Oscar Wilde did do the majority of his writing in England. In fact, once he was an adult, he did not really return to Ireland except for two brief visits, but he was born in Ireland. He is considered an Irish author, so we will touch on that as we go through. So for today's lecture, because one of the things Wilde was known for was having really great one-liners, you'll notice the title of every single one of my slides is actually one of his great lines, either that he said off the cuff or can be found in his writing. I did try to theme them to the slide. They're not randomly selected, but if you're wondering why the slides don't have more conventional titles, that's why. So for this first slide, we have, after a good dinner, one can forgive anybody, even one's own relations, which is supposedly actually a passive-aggressive dig at his own brother who he was mad at the time. But this is just to talk about generally the background and some of his ancestry. So at the time of Wilde's birth, which was in 1854, the potato famine was starting to subside. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the potato famine as an event, but just to put it in context, in 1841, the population of Ireland was almost 8.2 million, and by 1871, it was 4.4 million. Tremendous amount of death and also emigration. This period also saw the emergence of the Irish Republican or Fenian Brotherhood, which was a secret society whose aim was the achievement by force of an Irish republic. Wilde himself is descended from a long line of Irish people and some Anglo-Irish ancestors, meaning folks from England who had come over. His great uncle was Charles Robert Maturin, also known as C.R. Maturin, an Irish Protestant clergyman who was ordained in the Church of Ireland. He was also a writer of Gothic plays and novels, so Wilde came by his vocation pretty clearly. And on his father's side, Wilde was descended from a Dutchman, Colonel de Wilde, who went to Ireland with King William of Orange's invading army in 1690. And he was also descended from a lot of Irish bricklayers, so he had a pretty varied ancestry. So children begin by loving their parents. As they grow older, they judge them, and sometimes they forgive them. So I want to talk first about Wilde's father, whose name was Sir William Robert Wilde. He would live from 1815 to 1876, and he was Ireland's leading ophthalmological ear and eye surgeon. He began his career in medicine by being an attending physician on a long cruise around Europe. And he, by all accounts, really learned a lot on that voyage. So when he came back, he wrote a book about his travels and theories that he had on the origins of his people. And it went on to become a bestseller. It's called The Narrative of a Voyage to Madeira, Tenerife, and Along the Shores of the Mediterranean. He was known widely as a philanthropist, and he cared for the city's poor in Dublin. In 1841, he's appointed as Assistant Commissioner of the Irish Census. Through this position, he was able to gather important information on the status of both the blind and deaf in Ireland. He did have a little bit of a dark side in that before he got married, he fathered 3 illegitimate children. He did financially support all 3 of these children, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them later, but it is important to note that he was not a saint. He was knighted in 1864, both as a service as his medical advisor and for his work with the census. And that's a portrait of him. The beautiful thing about Oscar Wilde is that he comes along in the age of photography. So we actually have photos not just of himself, but of his extended family. I've included those where possible. All women become like their mothers. That is their tragedy. No man does. That's his. So let's talk about Lady Wilde, who was born Jane Francisca Elgie in Wexford. She was the daughter of an archdeacon who passed away when she was just 3 years old. She was self-educated, and it said that she could speak up to 10 languages by the age of 18. She herself was also a writer, you may notice a theme, and she had the pen name Speranza. And under that name, she started publishing poems in a magazine called The Nation. We're going to talk about a lot of magazines today. They were very, very common at the time. I mean, the decline of the magazine is probably a whole other topic, but at this point, things that you could subscribe to were very important. And she wrote a lot of pro-Irish independence and anti-British writing. That's why she had a pen name, and she was sometimes known as Speranza of the Nation. Her editor, Charles Gavin Duffy, was called to trial based on, or they tried to shut down the paper, I should say. And then they brought Duffy to court based on one of Speranza's articles, and he refused to name her as the author. He stood up in court and claimed responsibility for the article. They ignored this, and they wound up permanently shutting the paper down. So it didn't work out so great. So these are Wilde's parents, two very active and involved people. Both of them are writers. Both of them are very involved. And move back over here in what's going on in the country at the time. Line is actually from a poem. Coffin board, heavy stone lie on her breast. I vex my heart alone. She is at rest. So Jane and Sir William have 3 children together. This is not including the illegitimate children who came before them, with Sir William's illegitimate children. Their firstborn son was William Robert Kingsley Wiles Wilde. He studied law, but he did wind up becoming a journalist, which is not the last person that we will hear this about in the course of this presentation, believe it or not. Law was a very common thing to study as a wealthy middle-class child. Willie is what he was generally called by those who knew him, and he was thought to be a brilliant talker and writer, but he did not live up to his potential. So he struggles with alcoholism his entire life. I don't believe they called it that at that point, but he was a heavy drinker. He marries a very wealthy woman who takes him with her to New York and ultimately divorces him because of his drinking. He does then get remarried, and he does have a daughter with his second wife, but he winds up dying before Oscar Wilde. He's only 46. It's complications from the alcoholism. Jane and Sir William then have Oscar, and they have a child after Oscar, a daughter that they name Isola Francesca Emily. And Oscar and Isola are very close, and she passes unexpectedly away from home. She gets a brain fever. It's hard to know what really killed her, but she got extremely ill. She died very, very quickly. She was only 10 years old, and Wilde mourns her for the rest of his life. Scholars recently uncovered elegies in Wilde's unpublished notebooks dedicated to her. That's what the line above is from. You'll also see that picture to the left with the crosses. That contains a piece of Isola's hair, and that's what the inscription says. It says, "My Isola's hair" on top, and it was found among Wilde's possessions when he died. He died, as we'll get to later, pretty broke, without owning very much, but he had kept this envelope with him for his entire life. So that was a very early. So we see on the right there, we have a photograph of teenage Oscar Wilde. That's the youngest photo I could find of him. There may be younger, but that's the one I could locate. The quote we have on top is, "The best way to make children good is to make them happy," which I quite like. He is born in 20 Wesleyan Row, Dublin, on October 15th, 1854. He is born into the Church of Ireland, which I note for a few reasons. One, because I don't know that it's as commonly known as the Church of England, but it was a separate entity. Also, their records did not survive as intact. So we actually don't have, I believe, a record of his birth, not one that I could locate anyway. The first 10 years of his life, he was homeschooled. Obviously, both of his parents were pretty educated, so being homeschooled was not a huge loss for him. His nanny was French and his governess was German, and they both taught him to speak their languages. So he had a pretty decent mastery of French. I don't know how long he retained the German, but he does live in France periodically as an adult, so it's likely that he retained quite a bit of the French. Then he does start attending school. He goes to the Pretoria Royal School until 1871. And he was not as popular as his brother, although people did like him. His brother was a glib talker and very charismatic. So he was kind of living in his brother's shadow at school. But from an early age, he was already demonstrating a propensity for the artistic and the literary world. And he particularly liked the classics of Greece and Rome. This would not be as unusual then as it would be today. The classics were so widely taught, they were considered a fundamental part of education at the time. So that would not have been as surprising. In the summers when he wasn't at school, they owned a villa Matura house in County Mayo. So he spent summers with his family. So even though he was at school, he was with his family quite a bit as well. Because he was good with these oral translations of Greek and Latin, he won a ton of prizes, including the Carpenter Prize for Greek Testament. And he was one of only 3 students at his school to win the Royal School Scholarship to Trinity in 1871. So there's Oscar Wilde in his college years. Education is an admirable thing, but it is well to remember from time to time that nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. Um, it's hard to know how many of these little bon mots that Wilde drops he full-heartedly believed in, because he certainly preferred to be clever or funny in the moment over necessarily saying something very profound, although he often does both. So something to keep in mind. He actually has quotes about contradicting himself. Those I didn't have readily available, but it's something he often said. So during his years at Trinity, Oscar shared rooms with his brother Willie. So Willie's around again studying law. His tutor, so with the education system at Trinity and later at Oxford, you are under the supervision essentially of a single tutor. So you go to many classes, but your work was assigned by a single tutor. His was Professor J.P. Mahaffey, who was a really great classic scholar. And while Wilde was famous, Professor Mahaffey would brag about Wilde's time as his pupil, but when his star fell, he called him the only blot on his tutoring career, which is quite the heel turn. So make of that what you will. The University Philosophical Society met weekly, and it was also a place for education and a location for Wilde to develop his intellect. He helped publish a little magazine with the Philosophical Society. He went to pretty much all the meetings. That's one of the places he definitely sharpened his intelligence and his wit. He came first in his class in his first year, won a scholarship by competitive examination in his second, and in his finals won the Berkeley Gold Medal in Greek, the university's highest academic award. So he was very clever. This was his strong point. He was encouraged to compete for a half scholarship, which would have been worth about $10,000 today, 95 pounds at the time, to go to Magdalen College in Oxford, and he won it. I think often we'll talk about Oxford as a singular college, but Oxford is actually made up of many smaller colleges. So he was going to the Magdalen College in Oxford. The exquisite art of idleness, one of the most important things that any university can teach. I find this one particularly funny because Wilde does have a very big dichotomy of personality where he's actually very industrious. He writes pretty consistently through most of his adult life. He is an extremely good marketer of himself. He's out hustling all of that. But he professed to follow a philosophy of essentially hedonism and idleness. But he could not have become as famous as he did as if he lived what he preached. He was not nearly as idle as he liked to make himself out to be. You don't come first in your class because you don't do very much work. So during his time in Oxford, Wilde would pursue several interests. He does wind up becoming a Freemason, and he goes very hard into Freemasonry in the early years of college. But by the time he leaves school, he just lets his membership lapse and he's never a part of it again. He has a lifelong interest in Catholicism. Remember, he's born into the Church of Ireland. He does not convert at this time, but he talks about it often. And while at college, he becomes known for his role in the aesthetic and decadent movements. So he's already starting to live the life of a dandy. He's very interested in clothes, and he wears hair long. He does not compete in what he calls manly sports, even though he does occasionally box, apparently. But he's not out there playing football for sure, soccer. He decorated his rooms with peacock feathers, lilies, sunflowers, blue china, and other objects to art. And one of his earliest little epigrams, one of his little one-liners that becomes famous is he says, "I find it harder and harder to live up to my blue china." So stage setting is already becoming very important for him, both in how he personally presents himself and how he presents his environment. Everything has to look and feel a certain way to project the correct image. William Pater writes a book called Studies in the History of the Renaissance. It becomes Wilde's favorite book. He always has a copy with him, again, until almost the day he dies. He refers to it often, and he does meet the author in his third year at Oxford. Pater has a style of treating art with humor and also tremendous devotion, and that is a huge influence on Oscar Wilde. He also meets at the same time John Ruskin, another scholar who is kind of a counter argument to Pater, who thinks that art exists purely for the betterment of society, not as a beautiful object. Wilde said of Ruskin, he spoke to us not on art this time, but on life. He thought, he said, that we should be working at something that would do good to other people. It's something by which we might show that in all labor there is something noble. So even though Wilde did not get up early, did not like manual labor, he was so enthralled by Ruskin, who again was not preaching really a life that Wilde was particularly interested in living, that when Ruskin had this project of planting flowers along country lanes, Wilde got up early and went and was one of the participants in that, along with a lot of his other fellow students. So here on the right, we have another picture of Wilde in this period of his life. He says, I like looking at geniuses and listening to beautiful people, which is one of his fun little inversions that he likes to throw out there. After college, he returns only briefly to Ireland. He is reintroduced to his childhood sweetheart, Florence Balcombe. So they had courted briefly, they knew each other, and he was hoping to re-strike up that relationship. But instead, she meets and marries a real nobody named Bram Stoker. And if that might be familiar to you, another one of the writers of the age. Wilde was pretty heartbroken. He took it well, but he told her that he was going back to England and he was never going to come back to Ireland. He pretty much kept his promise. He comes back to Ireland only twice and only for short visits after this point. During his years in Oxford, his father did pass away, and Wilde inherited money from the sale of some of the houses that his father had owned. He's not obviously the main inheritor because he's not the firstborn son, but he does get some money. He uses that money to set himself up in London. He's in a boarding house. It was a very nice boarding house. It wasn't unusual for single young men at that time to stay in a boarding house. You wouldn't have to retain your own servants. Food was served, so you wouldn't have to cook for yourself, that kind of thing. It's kind of seen as respectable. He meets Lily Langtry, who becomes a lifelong friend. She's kind of like a glamour queen, like a high society lady, and she's extremely important to him, and she introduces him everywhere. She's very well known. She's famous for being famous. She's just a glamour queen who goes to a lot of salons, and Wilde loves that about her. So they make a good pair. Wilde had already started writing. He had written a lot of poetry during his college career and a lot of essays. But he finally has enough poetry to publish a book in 1877. It sells all 750 copies, which was a pretty decent run for a first poetry book. It's not particularly well reviewed, so people don't have tons of great things to say about it, but does sell out. And then we have this really interesting thing happen. Wilde himself starts to become famous because of how he presents himself in the world. So I love this photo of him. It's everywhere. If you've ever seen anything with Oscar Wilde about documentary, people tend to really grab this whole photo shoot. There's a bunch of photos from this particular photo shoot. I don't know if they would have called it a photo shoot at the time, but that's what it is. This is from 1882. He's only 27 in this picture, but you can see his hair is longer. It's very immaculately kept. He's in a many layered outfit. He has the cane, which is purely for looks. He didn't require that. And he's got that scholarly intent look, but you can see that he's wearing a pretty big ring. The whole look is a kind of a decadent, perfected, polished appearance. And he became kind of known as being this peacock who looked a certain way and was generally one of the most well-spoken people in the room. So why does this matter? Well, he's only published a book and a couple of essays. His writing is not particularly widespread yet. And yet because he's known, he's hired to go do 150 talks in America for a very interesting reason. He's in a play he's not in the play, I'm sorry. There's a play written that does fairly well, and he is parodied in the play as a peacocking buffoon. The character is not a flattering portraiture of himself. The character's not called Oscar Wilde, but anyone who saw it, who knew him, knew it was a parody of him. This is not even the last time this happens to him. Gilbert and Sullivan decide to make it into an operetta, but they're worried that the American audience won't get the joke because they haven't been exposed to Oscar Wilde. They don't know who it would be parodying. So their producer invites Wilde to come give this lecture tour, introduce him to America. So essentially when this operetta comes out, people will get who it's meant to parody. Oscar Wilde did not go to America with very high hopes. You can see his quote there is, "America is the only country that went from barbarism to decadence without civilization in between." So he didn't think particularly highly of America before coming here. However, you would think that he wouldn't be very well received. Quite the opposite. He's very charismatic, and he finds that he really likes a lot of the people that he meets. And part of that is because he's very friendly and he's interested in having a wide audience. He does not limit himself to the intelligentsia. He goes and meets everybody. He sits down with cowboys and farmers, and they seem to really like him. At one point, he climbs down to the bottom of a mine shaft so he can talk to some miners. And reportedly, everybody had a great time. He had a good time. The miners had a good time. He says he tells a story and everybody applauds. Um, but he really understood people. And generally, the reviews that came out of these visits was that people found him to be very hospitable and very accessible. He really already understood how to market himself. He couldn't come in and be a prima donna. He was not famous enough for that yet. He had to come in and be interested and be welcoming. So there's a local reporter in Arizona who visits Wilde's hotel room, and they said, "We can recall nothing to ridicule, even though we were so disposed." Like, people went in hoping to make fun of him and instead are greeted super courteously. And he is redone his rooms wherever he's staying to look a little more rustic. He just doesn't try to dress them up like he did his rooms in Oxford, but they're elaborate sets. He's kind of creating these welcoming sets. And as he's traveling, he's really getting a handle on how to be what we would now call an influencer, how to use the press and publicity to make him look the best. And one of the things that he really wanted in traveling to America was to meet Walt Whitman. When he gets here, Whitman is in his 60s. He's recovering from a stroke. He's not well. And Wilde does reach out to him personally. He sends him a letter and says, "Look, I'd really like to meet you." And Whitman says, I can't do that. I'm just not well enough. I'm not interested. I don't know who you are." Because again, Wilde's not particularly famous, especially not in America. So Oscar Wilde realizes he has to use the press to get Walt Whitman to come out and meet him. What he does, because the press keeps saying, "Oh, Oscar Wilde is like the successor of Walt Whitman," and he knows that Oscar knows immediately he cannot position himself that way, or Whitman will never meet with him. So instead, he speaks to newspapers and he's incredibly flattering of Whitman. He talks about how Whitman is his idol. He talks about what a great writer he is, which were all things he probably really felt. Like I said, he did genuinely want to meet Walt Whitman very badly. And Whitman is a lot like Oscar Wilde in that he responds to flattery, and the flattery works. He agrees to meet with him, and they both say, "No reporters. We're going to meet just the two of us." And this was clever for a lot of reasons. They were both good showmen, and what they realized is if they met without reporters, they could give two separate interviews afterwards and both get equal press about this meeting. And that's what they do. They both gave separate accountings to newspapers, so the publicity was twice as large because they didn't allow anybody in. By both of their reports, they both had a really good time, and they really enjoyed each other's company and liked each other very much. But again, we only have their word for it because nobody else was in the room. The man who says his wife can't take a joke forgets that she took him. So Oscar poking at himself a little bit there, maybe. But we have that picture on the right where you can see Oscar Wilde with his wife and one of his sons. So Oscar Wilde is introduced to Constance Lloyd 4 years earlier than his trip to America in London. When he returns to America, he's still doing his lectures on classic literature, classics, I should say. He goes back to Dublin briefly. That's one of his first short visits. They meet at this lecture, and they get engaged really quickly after that, and they get married in May of 1884. Constance is the daughter of a barrister. She's wealthy, intelligent, and forward-thinking. She writes a book of children's stories not long after they get married. And it seemed like in their early years, at least, the marriage was actually quite a happy one. They enjoyed each other. And Wilde's really supportive of Constance, who is very invested in women's rights. So she's particularly pushing for reforming dress, but she has interest in a bunch of equality acts, and she writes about them extensively, and Wilde is very supportive of that. There's evidence that she was reading and helping Oscar with his writing at this time. So they were certainly supporting each other. They wind up having two sons. They have Cyril in 1885 and Vivian in 1886. During this time, he takes over the management of a failing magazine. I told you magazines will come up a lot, called Ladies' World. trying to supplement Constance's annuity. So Constance, one of the reasons that Oscar might have married her is she does have a yearly salary from her inheritance. She gets 250 pounds a year, which was substantial, but they had extremely expensive tastes, both of them. They were both into being trend makers. They wanted things to look right. So they were spending more than Constance's annuity, which meant Wilde still had to work. Was not as idle, like I said, as all appearances may have suggested. So here's the part of Oscar Wilde that you may be a little bit more familiar with than his happy home life in the early years. Francine, I could not find, so Francine asked what kind of dress reforms was Constance proposing. I could not find an exact rundown of what she was looking for, but my guess would be a moving away from skirts, because that was already beginning to come up, and probably less restriction on how much skin a woman could show. It was just extremely repressive at the time. So here the quote is, "I shall turn and whisper to you, Robbie, Robbie, let us pretend we do not hear it." He was saying that in a longer letter about Judgment Day, that they would be with each other instead of thinking about Judgment Day. Robbie being Robert Ross. You can see that picture of him on the left there. So after the birth of their second child, by all accounts, the marriage changed substantially. Constance's body was very affected by the second pregnancy, but it's hard to say what exactly happened. There's no record of them drifting apart so much as we know that Wilde meets Robbie Ross. At the time is only 17 years old. He's already interested in Oscar Wilde. He pursues him pretty doggedly, and it seems pretty likely that the two would become lovers. Nina, yes, the program is being recorded, and I will post it on YouTube next week on the library's YouTube channel. Ross was extremely insistent about being open about his sexuality. So even in this time period, he didn't care. He told people that he was gay. He did not back down about it. And because of that, he was bullied out of college. He was pretty roughly treated. And there were really harsh laws around homosexuality at the time, but he was really dogged about it. He was out to his family, who were no longer speaking to him because of it. And he becomes a well-regarded reporter in his own right. He continues living that life. He does live briefly with the Wildes at this point. I don't know how Constance felt about that, but he did move in. And he and Wilde will stay friends for the rest of their lives. Ross comes to his aid in his later years, and he will be at Wilde's deathbed, so we'll see him there at the end. He also is ultimately the one who's entrusted to be Wilde's literary executor, and by all accounts does a very good job of it. Doesn't keep any of the money from himself. All that money does wind up going to Wilde's children. So pretty moral upstanding at the end. But we know that Oscar Wilde is a writer, so let's talk about that a little bit. One of his quotes on writing, "A writer is someone who has taught his mind to misbehave." So he is writing all throughout his life. I'm just touching on the major works, but he's writing essays and short stories all the time. He did, during this period, have a brief dabbling in political writing. He wrote a fairly socialist work that's still available, I think, on the internet if you can find it. But he finally does publish a book. It starts out as a magazine story. He edits it a lot, which we'll talk about. But in 1890, he publishes The Picture of Dorian Gray. If you're not familiar, it's a pretty simple premise. A very beautiful young man is painted, and he mourns the fact that his painting will not age while he does. And something happens in that moment, and the opposite becomes true. The portrait ages and takes on a terrible visage, while Dorian Gray himself does not age and looks eternally youthful. Having this outlet lets him be cruel and nasty and never show it. So what's happening in this story that I think luckily has diminished is that in the Victorian era, it was definitely believed that your morals were on your skin. So if you were ethically bad, you were probably physically unappealing. Those two things were really heavily related. If you read Dorian Gray, the kinds of things that happens to the portrait are like warts and wrinkles, things that we were deemed unattractive at the time happen to the portrait, not because of aging necessarily, but because of the sinful acts of Dorian Gray. The artist Basil is very openly admiring Dorian in the opening scenes. And this is where most of the objections to the novel begin. So as soon as it's published, it's immediately criticized. They felt that the references to homosexuality were so thinly veiled that anyone could pick up on them reading them. One paper called it nasty and nauseous. And this was after extensive rewrites. Wilde went through line by line and redacted a tremendous amount, both from the original manuscript and its first appearance as a magazine story. He was revising Dorian Gray really significantly. You can find all sorts of published versions of Dorian Gray out there where people have tried to put back in what was deleted by Wilde himself to protect himself essentially as its author, but everything he did didn't work. People still really objected to it. Wilde's probably most successful stint in his writing career during his lifetime was as a playwright. He says, I regard the theater as the greatest of all art forms, the most immediate way in which a human being can share with another the sense of what it is to be a human being. So he felt pretty profoundly about the theater. He wrote 2 plays in the 1880s, but neither are particularly well received. He goes back to Paris in 1890, where he briefly lived, and he takes another try, and he writes a play inspired by the story of Salome. It's a play still performed today, but at the time, it wouldn't be performed for another 6 years. It does not happen immediately. The play that is an immediate hit is Lady Windermere's Fan. It was written next, but it'd be performed 4 years before Salome. And it really launches his career as a playwright, particularly as one who critiques society. He earns the modern equivalent of $1 million off of this play. It was about 900,000, I think, when I was doing the math. After that, he writes A Woman of No Importance in 1893, and then An Ideal Husband in 1894. One that comes after that is the one that I named the talk after, which is The Importance of Being Earnest. It's probably the most famous of his plays. It's certainly the one that's lasted the longest. It's been remade 1,000,000 times. Just share a little clip of Wilde's great dialogue, which happens so quickly. I really love, I can hardly eat a muffin in an agitated way, which I appreciate. But with every great rise, there is often a great fall. And if you know anything about the story of Oscar Wilde, there is a fall coming. And the accidental architect of his downfall is a man named Lord Alfred Douglas, often referred to as Boise. So at the top, we have a fraction of a letter that Wilde wrote to Boise. I must see you soon. You are the divine thing I want, the thing of grace and genius. So all throughout writing these 4 plays, Wilde was already having an affair with Lord Alfred Douglas. He's called Boise. It was a corruption of boyish by his mother, and the nickname stuck. He's the 3rd son of John Douglas, the 9th Marquis of Queensberry, and his first wife, Sybil Montgomery. His mother divorced his father on grounds of adultery, which was one of the ways women actually could get out of a marriage at the time. Boise receives a very fine education, but he drops out of the same college that Wilde had attended without a degree. Boise's cousin introduces him to Wilde in 1891, and they begin the tempestuous relationship that would seal Wilde's fate. They were known to be on again, off again, extremely dependent on one another. Wilde gave Boise money to support all of his vices, basically all of his habits. And all of this, despite the rules against homosexuality, were not happening as quietly as one might imagine. It was pretty known within their circle that the two of them were together, to the point where, remember I said that satirization happens again? There's an entire novel written satirizing their relationship called The Green Carnation. This novel permanently ties the flower, the green carnation, to Oscar Wilde, and you'll often see that come up when people are talking about him. Was considered a signifier of his homosexuality, but likely at the time it was just a flower that he wore to a premiere that his supporters also wore when the night one of his plays came out. It's not known for sure, but that's likely what it was actually representing. But green carnation has become a representation, or did for some time, of homosexuality in general, a positive signifier. Boise himself was a poet, and he actually coined a phrase that is generally associated with Oscar Wilde, but was not said by Oscar Wilde, and that's referring to their love affair as the love that dare not speak its name. That's probably Alfred Douglas's most famous poem. We know not whether laws be right or whether laws be wrong. So like I said at the time, Homosexuality as a whole was outlawed, and his lack of discretion about his affair with Boise would get Wilde in a lot of trouble. And his lack of discretion was only shadowed by how much Boise would flaunt it. He was very proud of having Wilde not only as a lover, but as a supporter of his poetry. And he was very loud about being with him. So you might imagine that his father, who's the Marquis of Queensberry, was not thrilled. So you may recognize the word Queensberry as in the rules of boxing. Same guy. That's Boise's father. So definitely known for some rough behavior. He confronts his son and Oscar Wilde about their relationship several times. He shows up to places they are. He writes letters. He tells Wilde to leave his son alone on many occasions. And at one point, he shows up at the Wilde family home and threatens to beat Wilde up if he appears in public with Boise again. And while at the time Wilde spun the story as himself as a very witty, saying witty things and tearing Queensberry down, he admits in private to being extremely shaken by the confrontation. He's not really much of a physical fighter. And obviously Queensberry is pretty much known for that. On February 1895, Queensberry leaves a calling card at Wilde's club, the Albemarle. So your club, when you were a Victorian gentleman, would have been a place you spent a lot of time. It was a physical building. You paid dues. It's a little bit like a country club. There would be a place to eat. There would be a library. There would be gaming. And you would meet people in your set, whatever kind of person you were. You would meet other people just like you. It was a place where your reputation meant quite a lot. And the cards that you left were visible to the servants who you left them with and often to other people. That's why this was considered to be a really bad deal, because what he left on the card was the inscription for Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite. Boise immediately pushes Oscar Wilde to sue his father for libel. Now remember, libel is when you say something untrue about someone. This is a problem because what Queensberry is accusing Wilde of, in not great language, is in fact true. Oscar Wilde does have homosexual relationships. So literally every single one of Oscar Wilde's friends said, do not do this. You're going to get in trouble. Boise wins. Boise's always going to win when it comes to Oscar Wilde. I like no law at all. Were there no law, there'd be no lawbreakers, so all men would be virtuous. The libel suit goes forward and Queensberry is arrested. Under the law at the time, to prove a libel case, to protect himself, he has to prove that his accusations weren't unfounded. So essentially, Oscar Wilde's sexuality is to be put on trial for the first of 3 times. George Bernard Shaw, as every famous writer seems to have touched Wilde's life, was there as Wilde's friend begged him to flee to France. They begged him, please run away, don't stay here. Wilde and Boise storm out of that conversation, and Wilde said something to the effect of like, situations like this show you who your real friends are. Of course, his real friend was the one that he stormed away from. He should have left the country. Queensberry hires a private detective, and he produces a number of witnesses. Wilde, through Boise, met a lot of male sex workers, and many of them were blackmailed essentially to speak out against him because they were complicit in these illegal acts and could be jailed, and they did not have the resources that Wilde had. Because of this, Queensberry is acquitted of the charges. Wilde's mother, speaking of people who are not super helpful, encourages him to stand and fight while his friends beg him to leave. And the problem is that Oscar Wilde seems to lose all his fight in that moment. He just seems to give up. He says it's too late. He has a quote about missing the train. It's over. He's going to stay and he's going to face his own trial, which is going to occur right after. I do have this quote up here, which is from the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which he would write after his imprisonment, but I thought it was appropriate. For each man kills the thing he loves, yet each man does not die, the prison of its prey. So the first trial against Wilde, the jury can't reach a verdict. And Wilde's friends and a reverend who was very moved by his plight managed to make bail so he doesn't have to stay in the jail. So in an ordinary case, that might have been the end of it. He's had one trial. They couldn't come to a conclusion. If he was a nobody, that probably would have been it. The problem was by now, Wilde was so famous and the case had been so widely politicized that they couldn't let it go. It had to go to a second trial, and that second trial ends in a conviction. They have too much evidence against him. Again, he was doing all of these things. So this was why the libel case was really would have been impossible for him to win, really. He thought he could defeat it just by being clever, and it just didn't work in his favor. Um, a lot of the people that came up in his trial were in their late teens. So someone asked about Boise's age, because obviously his relationship with Robbie began when Robbie was 17. It's important to note the age of consent in England at the time was 16. It had actually recently been raised from 13. So that was not the illegal part. Make of that what you will, though, morally, however that makes you feel. It's understandable. That was definitely a part of his life, was that some of the people that he was intimate with were in their late teens, 17, 18 years old. He would wind up serving 2 years at Reading Gaol during hard labor. So 2 years may not sound like very much, but prison was not then what it is now. Hard labor was extremely hard labor. This would wind up breaking down Wilde's body in a way he would never really recover from, especially as a man who had been a gentleman and hadn't been doing anything particularly physical before this. It wore him out. The first administration that was at Reading Gaol when he got there did not let him write. He was deprived of even a pen and paper. It was towards the second half of his incarceration, the head of the prison changed, and he thought that writing would be more medicinal for Wilde, and he's allowed to write. And he's not getting a lot of letters from Boise, which pains him pretty excessively. Wilde's thinking about him all the time. So he writes a letter to Boise, which he is not allowed to send. And it is 50,000 words long. So it is the length of a short novel. And it ultimately becomes known as De Profundis, and it is published posthumously, so after he passes away. Hard labor, it varied, but essentially when you think of like laborers breaking up rock all day, very much stuff like that. There was a wheel that you would have to kind of walk up, almost like a stairmaster, but hellish to keep something turning. He probably would have been doing that for several hours a day. It was backbreaking stuff. It was things that you could really only get away having prisoners do, because no one would do for money if they could get away with it. So yeah, so this letter would be called De Profundis. It's very philosophical. It's full of love notes, as one might imagine. It's a really interesting read. I have read it. If you're really interested in Wilde's writing, it's an interesting read. So there on the left, we have the last known photograph of Oscar Wilde, which was taken just a few months before his death. So he leaves the prison in poor health, and he leaves for France as soon as he's released, and he never comes back to England. He does feel a call again to Catholicism. He applies to the 6-month spiritual retreat, and the church rejects him, which he is extremely hurt by. He weeps over the rejection. He really wanted to become Catholic, and it just never happened for him. During his time in prison, Wilde witnesses a hanging. It's the first hanging that happens in 18 years at the Gaol, and the man is hanged for murdering his wife. And that's when he writes, after he gets out, this long, firm poem called The Ballad of Reading Gaol. And the reoccurring line throughout the ballad is that each man kills the thing he loves, which, considering he went to prison for arguably for love, probably resonated pretty strongly with Wilde. He does write letters as well to papers anonymously, asking for prison reform, appealing to his own experience. He is briefly reunited with Bosie. Bosie does come to France to be with him. All of Oscar Wilde's friends are like, absolutely not. At the time, Constance is his wife, which I'll get to exactly what Constance does, but she is sending Oscar £2 a week to live off of. And she tells him from afar, I won't continue to send you money if you live with Boise. Boise's family threatens to cut him off if they continue to live together, so they part again under that pressure. Wilde begins to drink, and after a couple of awkward encounters that he has when he's out walking, because it's the only time he got out of his hotel room, he meets people who used to know him before his fall, and it's too embarrassing and awkward for him. He can't take it, so he confines himself to the hotel that he's in. He's pretty close to poverty. He has very little money. He's languishing in this hotel room. And in November, he writes to Robbie telling him that he feels very weak. He begs him to come. His last famous one-liner is uttered in the days before his death, because he's looking around this horrible hotel room that he's stuck in, and he says to Robbie, "This wallpaper is terrible. Either it goes or I do." And unfortunately, it was Wilde, and by November 30th of that year, he is dead. It's speculated he died from meningitis. There was a lot of debate for some time that Wilde might have had syphilis, which caused the meningitis, that he might have given the syphilis to his wife at some point, but there's no concrete evidence that that's the case. Neither of the doctors who examined him after gave like a full accord of what had occurred, but kind of ironic considering it was a brain fever that took his beloved little sister when she was 10 and came for him in the end. So for myself, the only immortality I desire is to invent a new sauce. And arguably, Wilde did invent a new sauce. He invented marketability. He probably was one of the most famous one-liner creators of all time. Certainly quite the sauce. He's initially buried outside of Paris, but his remains in 1909 are moved to the Père Lachaise Cemetery, which is inside the city. The tomb that he ultimately rests in is commissioned by Robbie, one of his oldest friends, an ex-lover. And Robbie has a drawer set into that tomb to hold Robbie's ashes when he dies. And that happens in 1950. Robbie dies 50 years after Oscar. Oscar dies in 1900. And Robbie's buried with him. So he never changed that desire even 50 years after Oscar's death. Constance, Oscar's wife, she changes her last name and both boys' last name when Oscar goes to prison to Holland. They move to Switzerland to escape stigma after his imprisonment, and the boys are never allowed to see him again. He dies without ever seeing his kids again. But Constance actually dies before Wilde. She dies in 1897. And her death is shrouded in mystery. There's a lot of debate as to what happened to her. She did have some kind of botched surgery shortly before her death. It's unclear if she dies because of the botched surgery or because of what caused the botched surgery. Some people said it was a bladder issue. It's unclear. And again, there was accusations that Wilde had given her syphilis, and that's what caused it. But it's not super clear, and it seems increasingly unlikely that it was syphilis. His oldest son, Cyril, goes on to have a military career, and he dies. He's killed by a sniper in World War I. His younger son, Vivian, studies law. He's also called to serve in World War I, but he survives. He goes on to write himself. And he eventually wrote an autobiography called Son of Oscar Wilde. And he claims that Wilde was actually quite a good father before his conviction when they were still all living together. He had good memories of his dad. Vivian has one child named Merlin Holland, and we heard from him. He was in that biography clip right at the beginning, and he is still alive. He's only 77. So Oscar Wilde has a living grandson who's 77 years old, and he has written a lot of books about his grandfather, including he's the one who has found the research to try and prove that Oscar Wilde, in fact, did not have syphilis. So he is still operating today. In 2017, the United Kingdom, the entire government of the United Kingdom, pardoned 50,000 plus men who had been convicted under anti-sodomy rules, including Oscar Wilde. You may have heard of this because one of the other people they pardoned was Alan Turing, who was the famous cryptologist who also had an enormous influence on Germany not winning World War II. Turing himself was caught up in the anti-sodomy laws. He was given a choice of prison or chemical castration. He chose chemical castration, but ultimately wound up committing suicide because of it. Turing was caught for a far less hubristic reason than Wilde was. Turing, he was robbed, and he made the mistake of reporting the robbery to the police. And in investigating the robbery, they discovered that he was engaging in homosexual behaviors, and they arrested him. So that was pretty rough, but they've all been pardoned since. So I love this statue. I got to see it in person. I didn't even know it was there. I've always loved Oscar Wilde. And when I went to Ireland for my honeymoon, our hotel was right down the street from this statue. It's one of my favorite kind of little memorial statues because you don't often see one that has color, but it only makes sense for Oscar Wilde, who was quite the peacock. He would have loved to have a colorful statue. You can't see, I believe in his other hand is an apple. But I love his expression, and he's facing his childhood home in Dublin. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining me.